From June 22nd to June 24th, 2007, Chris Benoit did the unthinkable. He decided in a 3-day span that he would kill his wife, kill his 7-year-old son, and then killed himself. It is one of the darkest days in the business, not only because of what Chris Benoit, how big Chris Benoit was as a professional wrestler, but 3 lives were lost on those days. 2 of them didn't have the choice in dying. And I'm always terrified thinking what happened at that house, what we knew happened at that house. And it's just so depressing. It really is. And with the 18-year anniversary here of the Benoit double murder, suicide, I thought I would take some time to reflect on what happened here and to talk about the Dark Side of the Ring review on the Chris Benoit double murder suicide, because they did a really phenomenal job with both parts. This is going to be focusing on part 1. Part 2 will be a separate episode. Let's get into it. So if you don't know, Chris Benoit was regarded as one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time. He was absolutely decorated. He was very, very technical, and he would do moves, and he had so many memorable matches that were crazy. Like, this guy was a perfectionist. And the stories I've heard about how dedicated he would be in the business is crazy. Chris Jericho even said in the documentary that he was so dedicated that even if it was a small botch, he would punish himself by doing 500 Hindu squats. Benoit was very decorated, and with how great he was in the ring, like, he was just so amazing that he easily would have been a Hall of Famer. He easily would have been a part of the Mount Rushmore, anyone's Mount Rushmore, but unfortunately, the man himself has tarnished his legacy with what he did. So, Benoit would often wrestle all these matches, and eventually he goes to Japan. He went to WCW. He went to WWE. He eventually has a close relationship with Eddie Guerrero, and you cannot mention Chris Benoit without the close relationship he had with Eddie Guerrero. They were very close friends. Like, Chris would often go to Eddie in regards to situations. They were like really close. Something I didn't know until I watched part 1 was I did not know that Eddie Guerrero originally hated Chris Benoit. And that was because Chris Benoit was a bit of a stiff worker. And in Japan, it would be Black Tiger. Eddie Guerrero wrestled as Black Tiger against the Pegasus Kid. That was Chris Benoit. And while in these matches working stiff, like, Eddie would not be happy. And he even called Vicky Guerrero during his time in New Japan, saying, I can't stand this guy. Every time we wrestle him, like, he's such a jerk. He's such this. But the thing that's interesting is the more that they fought with each other in the ring, the more they respected each other, and the more that they grew close, and they formed a friendship with each other. And I don't want to say, eventually, like, it became a bit of an unhealthy obsession for Benoit. We'll discuss that a little bit later, but I want to talk about Nancy Benoit, one of the victims in this entire Benoit murder-suicide. She married Chris Benoit. She actually had a pretty deep history in professional wrestling, too. She was a valet in the business. She often is regarded as the valet for Kevin Sullivan. She even, I think, was the valet for Sandman when she was in ECW. But yeah, Nancy Benoit was an amazing valet. She didn't have any formal training, but she was actually picked out while she was sitting in the crowd with her first husband. And she was this very striking, beautiful woman. And they started using her for shows. It went from being a weekend sort of thing to a full-time role for Nancy. And eventually she met Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan was the wrestler / booker in professional wrestling. And they eventually got married because Nancy was having problems with her first husband. So we're on to Kevin Sullivan here. She was a great valet for Kevin Sullivan, and she was called the Fallen Angel. And it sort of reminds me a lot of what Karrion Kross is nowadays, because Karrion Kross has that gimmick, and it's sort of like Beauty and the Beast sort of thing. And it was just such a they were paired very well. And eventually Kevin Sullivan and Nancy Benoit went to WCW. And Kevin Sullivan was one of the bookers of WCW. He would be the matchmaker, he would be involved in creative. And in WCW, he actually really liked Chris Benoit. He thought he was a great talent, great worker, and that he could make money. This wasn't mentioned in the documentary, but Chris Benoit was actually a part of the New Japan Pro Wrestling and WCW talent pool. They would be exchanging talents. Like New Japan would let them use this wrestler. WCW would allow them to use this sort of wrestler. It's sort of like what AEW in New Japan has been doing lately with Forbidden Door, and with what they're doing with CMLL and AEW and TNA and WWE, like all these partnerships. And Benoit was often flip-flopping around. And when he was in WCW, they were so impressed they gave him a full-time contract. So Chris Benoit is now in WCW. He has a feud with Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan, during the booking meetings, he decides to start a feud between the two because Sullivan sees money in him and could make them both look great. Sullivan decides to write a storyline to have a kayfabe real life affair with Nancy Benoit, well, Nancy Sullivan in this case, and Chris Benoit. Little did he know, Sullivan was booking his own divorce. That's the joke named in the industry, but let's be real, he really did book his own divorce, because in doing this type of storyline, Nancy would fall in love with Chris Benoit. So Sullivan wanted Nancy and Chris to keep the kayfabe of their affair, so they would share hotel rooms, they would hold hands in public, they would be intimate with each other in public and in vignettes. They kept together in the locker room, separated. Just listening to this, like, what was Kevin Sullivan thinking? Like, of course, if you're gonna have these two act this sort of way, they were gonna have a relationship together, and of course, they got close and they started a relationship. And it didn't also help that Sullivan was abusive to Nancy. I didn't know that there were abuse allegations before I watched that episode. They were first revealed in that show, and that resulted in Nancy going to the arms of Chris Benoit, and Chris would help Nancy out in those situations. Dean Malenko's wife, Julie, was also interviewed in this. She even saw Nancy having a black eye. They took photos and everything happened there. Sullivan and Benoit had a match. It was at the Bash at the Beach 1997 pay-per-view, and it turned into a legit fight. Like, they were punching each other really hard, legit. Chris Benoit even shattered Kevin Sullivan's eardrum during the match as well. And once the match was over, they went backstage and they had a fight. Sandra Toffaloni was actually, who's the sister-in-law of Benoit. She's also the sister of Nancy. She even said that, like, she didn't know what was going on. And Nancy said to Sandra, go with Chris. Do not go with Kevin Sullivan. And with the abuse allegations that were thrown at that way, Sandra went with Chris, and Sandra had the respect for Chris. And I gotta say, this episode does not paint Kevin Sullivan in a good light at all with the allegations that were thrown in there. Now, Sullivan was approached for comment, but he denied any abuse took place, and he didn't participate in this episode. So Chris and Nancy got together. David Benoit, who is the son of Chris Benoit, they were close with each other too. Like, there was no use of step, and eventually Daniel Benoit was born into this world. So it was a growing relationship between them. So they go back to Eddie Guerrero, the close relationship the two of them had. Eddie Guerrero was falling on hard times with his drug abuse. He had the steroid abuse, the painkiller addiction. He had alcohol issues. I mean, I've lost track how many times Eddie Guerrero has been arrested for DUI. His drug abuse was so bad that Eddie actually overdosed in his house like 3 times. The first 2 times Vicky did call the cops and the ambulance to try to get him out, but the third time she had enough of his abuse and of the steroids and of the drugs that, like, if she allowed him to overdose the third time without calling, and basically said to God, "You're going to take him now." And she decided to take the kids over to school. But it's crazy that, like, think how scary that is. That she had enough that like she was telling God, if you're gonna take him now. Like Eddie was at a really bad place at that time. And I remembered when Guerrero was at that sort of state, that Benoit was there to tuck him to bed, made sure he slept on his side, like made sure Eddie was okay during his issues. And eventually, Eddie gets fired from WWE in 2001 because they said in the episode he showed up to work inebriated. That's not 100% the reason. This wasn't mentioned, but Eddie actually had a DUI at the time. I mean, what else is new? Eddie Guerrero then got fired days after that DUI hit. So maybe he did show up inebriated, but I think it was that final drunk driving incident that resulted in him getting fired. Uh, I mean, it was the wake up call for Eddie because ever since that moment happened and he got himself cleaner, he got sober and WWE brought him back to the company. And eventually, WrestleMania 20 hits. And it's WrestleMania 20 is a weird WrestleMania now because of the main event and how like it's lost the time and you can't really like showcase that main event now. WWE hasn't like showcased it as often because of the whole Benoit stuff. And I think it's kind of cool how we got David Benoit, who was in the crowd. He didn't know what was going to happen during that show. Eddie Guerrero beat Kurt Angle for him to retain his WWE Championship. And then we had Chris Benoit versus Triple H versus Shawn Michaels, one of the greatest triple threat matches I've ever seen. I still believe Brock Lesnar, Seth Rollins, John Cena at Royal Rumble 2015 is my favorite triple threat match of all time. But this match was really, really good. And eventually Benoit won. It was such an emotional moment. The Benoit family is in the crowd. They were going to go to the ring. Eddie Guerrero is there first to hug him and wish him congratulations because both were close and everyone knew that the two of them were close together. And they're both on top of the world as champions. Then the Benoit family came in, hugged, and it's kind of sad him hugging Nancy and Daniel together and what would eventually happen with them laterwards. But David had a great point in this, and it's sad to think about, but he wished that he and Eddie would have retired on the show. And while they were both champions and would have been weird if both of them chose to retire as champions, he's got a point because that was the peak of both of their careers. It was the peak. And I don't think there was any better than that moment. And yes, it would have sucked losing certain moments later on in their careers, but with how bad their bodies were beaten and how mentally they weren't in the greatest spot and how they could have, transitioned into coaching and producing, I agree with David. I mean, maybe if Eddie and Chris did choose to retire, maybe the Benoit double murder suicide doesn't happen, but that was the peak of their career, and I agree with them. And now we got to get dark here because we're going to talk about Eddie Guerrero's death. So during a tour, Eddie Guerrero was going with Chavo and Chris Benoit. And Eddie was not acting like himself. Like he was passing out during conversations. Like then they got to Minnesota. It was a usual day. The three of them were planning to have a workout the next day. They agreed to meet in the morning to work out and both went to sleep. Chavo all of a sudden basically gets a call early in the morning from his front desk informing that something was wrong with his Uncle Eddie, and because he did not wake up from his wake-up calls, which was very, very rare for Eddie to do. So they went to his hotel room, knocked on the door, no answer. And what's heartbreaking, too, is that they tried calling him, nothing. They break the latch off the door. Eddie Guerrero was lying down on the floor with his toothbrush in hand and his underwear. Chavo is trying to get him to wake up. Like they're trying so hard to get him to reset his heart to wake up from what happened with him. And when they found Eddie, apparently he was still alive. Like Chavo could still feel him, and like he was still alive, and he was gurgling. Unfortunately, like Chavo, who's emotional telling the story, reveals that Eddie Guerrero passed in his arms. Like he could feel his body go from warm to cold. And I'm like, oh my God. Like to have your family member in your arms pass like that man, it's tough to even think about with Chavo, man. I mean, that could break anybody, and I'm glad he's in a good spot. But the worst part too was Eddie passed at the age of 38, which is crazy, and it's so young for him to die. Apparently, I'm reading this right now. In his autopsy, he passed away due to a heart failure. His heart was actually so enlarged due to the painkiller addiction he had and the lengthy steroid abuse that his heart just couldn't take it and passed. And he passed on that day. And so the worst news is that Chavo had to inform Chris of the news because Chris and them were going to work out. So Chris is in the lobby. He basically calls Chavo saying, "Hey man, is everything okay? Where are you guys at?" So basically Chavo's the one that basically informs Chris that Eddie passed away, and he lets out this moan. Like, he broke down, coming from a Chris Benoit who showed no emotion. For him to break down the way he did, like, it's devastating. And if you could imagine the sort of mindset that Benoit was, losing his friend and showing emotion like that, it's so upsetting. And they talked about how during the Eddie Guerrero Raw Tribute show, Benoit would even be filmed for reflecting on Guerrero's death, and he broke down there. He broke down during the funeral, and he was crying so much that Guerrero's suit jacket, his blazer was wet, his shirt was wet. Like, that's how much this guy was crying. Just brutal. Brutal. And even when in the aftermath, like, Chris would turn more into a hermit. He was more distant with everyone in the locker room. While he went back on the road immediately after the funeral, which I think was a tremendous mistake. Like, this man was clearly grieving for one of his best friends, and he should have taken time off to go heal mentally and grieve. So after the funeral happened and what happened with Eddie, Nancy decided to stick around with Vicky for a whole month to make sure she was okay, the kids were okay, and it would be Nancy that would wake Vicky up and help her grieve for Eddie, and to say, "You got to get out of bed, you got to go out, you got to help your kids out." She's a sweetheart, Nancy, for sticking with Vicky, helping her out. Chris would pop in from time to time, but it's sad with Chris. He would go to Vicky's bedroom, lie where Eddie Guerrero was sleeping, grabbed his pillow, grabbed everything. He would cry into the pillow, and he would even go into Eddie's weight room, and even Eddie's kids would say, "Chris is crying again." And Chris basically admits, "I'm lost without Eddie here." And it's so emotional for him. And he was so broken that they had Chris write his thoughts in a journal. And he was such in a bad spot that Nancy Benoit wanted Chris to retire in 2007. 2007 was the last year that he wrestled because of how mentally he was just checked out. And this is the words from Sandra Toffoloni that Nancy basically said to her. He was so grief-stricken on a monumental level that Nancy thought staying in the company and the business was eventually going to harm his well-being, which fortunately it did with the choices he decided to do. And Chris should have, if he retired, who knows what would have happened with his entire life. Maybe this wouldn't have happened, but he chose to continue professional wrestling. And Chris should have listened to Nancy. He should have, and he decided to keep going. And then we'll get to the end of this episode. We talked about how Chavo got those texts, like the dog is in the enclosed pool area, the garage door is open in the back. And then WWE sent the wellness check to Benoit's house. And eventually, at the end of the episode, the locker room was informed that the Benoit family had been found dead in their home. And that concludes the first part of the Benoit documentary. I'll go back to part 2 in a little bit when I record. It was tough watching the first part of this documentary. It felt more like an Eddie Guerrero Dark Side of the Ring episode, but you cannot tell the story of Chris Benoit, of what he did, without mentioning Eddie. Those two were close. And Benoit's friendship with Eddie was... It's so sad that he lost him there and what happened. That concludes my part 1 review of the Chris Benoit episode. Like I said, I'm going to record part 2 in a bit. Keep an eye out for that. And trust me, it's going to get dark. It's going to get dark. So be prepared. I hope you enjoyed this first part and that I did a good job with reviewing the first part of the episode. Check out all the other professional wrestling videos. Hit the subscribe button, the like button, hit the bell on the corner. Check out other content on stadiumrant.com. And if you're not down with that, we got 2 words for you. Acknowledge us.